United States war crimes are violations of the laws and customs of war committed by the United States Armed Forces since the signing of the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. These have included the summary execution of captured enemy combatants, the mistreatment of prisoners during interrogation, and the use of violence against civilian non-combatants. War crimes can be prosecuted in the United States through the War Crimes Act of 1996. However, the United States federal government does not accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court over its nationals, as the United States is not a party to the court. Philippine-American War. Following the end of the Spanish-American War, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States as part of the peace settlement. This triggered a more than a decade-long conflict between the United States Armed Forces and the First Philippine Republic under President Emilio Aguinaldo. War crimes committed by the United States Army include the march across Sarma, which led to the court-martial and forcible retirement of Brigadier General Jacob H. Smith. Moro Rebellion. American troops slaughtered hundreds of Moro Muslim women and children in the Moro Crater Massacre during the Moro Rebellion. World War II. Pacific Theater. On January 26, 1943, the submarine Wahoo fired on survivors in lifeboats from the Japanese transport by Moro. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood asserted the survivors were Japanese soldiers who had turned machine gun and rifle fire on the Wahoo after she surfaced, and that such resistance was common in submarine warfare. According to the submarine's executive officer, the fire was intended to force the Japanese soldiers to abandon the boats and none of them were deliberately targeted. Historian Clay Blair stated that the submarine's crew fired first and the shipwrecked survivors returned fire with handguns. The survivors were later determined to have included Allied POWs of the Indian 2nd Battalion, 16th Punjab Regiment, who were being escorted by Japanese Army forces from the 26th Field Ordnance Depot. Of 1,126 men originally aboard by Moro, 195 Indians and 87 Japanese died. Some killed during the torpedoing of the ship and some killed by the shootings afterward. During and after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, U.S. PT boats and Allied aircraft attacked Japanese rescue vessels as well as approximately 1,000 survivors from 8 sunken Japanese troop transport ships. The stated justification was that the Japanese personnel were close to their military destination and would be promptly returned to service in the battle. Many of the Allied aircrew accepted the attacks as necessary, while others were sickened. American servicemen during the Pacific War sometimes deliberately killed Japanese soldiers who had surrendered, according to Richard Aldrich. Aldrich published a study of diaries kept by United States and Australian soldiers, wherein it was stated that they sometimes massacred prisoners of war. According to John Dower, in many instances, Japanese who did become prisoners were killed on the spot or en route to prison compounds. According to Professor Aldrich, it was common practice for U.S. troops not to take prisoners. His analysis is supported by British historian Niall Ferguson, who also says that, in 1943, a secret U.S. intelligence report noted that only the promise of ice cream and 3 days leave would induce American troops not to kill surrendering Japanese. Ferguson states such practices played a role in the ratio of Japanese prisoners to dead, being 1 to 100 in late 1944. That same year, efforts were taken by Allied high commanders to suppress "take no prisoners" attitudes among their own personnel, and to encourage Japanese soldiers to surrender. Ferguson adds that measures by Allied commanders to improve the ratio of Japanese prisoners to Japanese dead resulted in it reaching 1 to 7 by mid-1945. Nevertheless, taking no prisoners was still standard practice among U.S. troops at the Battle of Okinawa, in April–June 1945. Ferguson also suggests that it was not only the fear of disciplinary action or of dishonor that deterred German and Japanese soldiers from surrendering. More important for most soldiers was the perception that prisoners would be killed by the enemy anyway, and so one might as well fight on. Ulrich Strauss, a U.S. Japanologist, suggests that Allied troops on the front line intensely hated Japanese military personnel and were not easily persuaded to take or protect prisoners, as they believed that Allied personnel who surrendered got no mercy from the Japanese. Allied troops were told that Japanese soldiers were inclined to feign surrender in order to make surprise attacks, a practice which was outlawed by the Hague Convention of 1907. Therefore, according to Strauss, senior officers opposed the taking of prisoners on the grounds that it needlessly exposed American troops to risks when prisoners nevertheless were taken at Guadalcanal. Army interrogator Captain Burden noted that many times POWs were shot during transport because it was too much bother to take them in. U.S. historian James J. Wayne Dartner attributes the very low number of Japanese in U.S. prisoner of war compounds to two important factors, namely a Japanese reluctance to surrender, and a widespread American conviction that the Japanese were animals or subhuman, and unworthy of the normal treatment accorded to prisoners of war. The latter reason is supported by Ferguson, who says that Allied troops often saw the Japanese in the same way that Germans regarded Russians, as intermention, rape. It has been claimed that some U.S. military personnel raped Okinawan women during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945. Based on several years of research, Okinawan historian Oshiro Masayasu writes, soon after the U.S. Marines landed, all the women of a village on Motobu Peninsula fell into the hands of American soldiers. At the time, there were only women, children, and old people in the village, as all the young men had been mobilized for the war. Soon after landing, the Marines mopped up the entire village, but found no signs of Japanese forces. Taking advantage of the situation, they started hunting for women in broad daylight, and women who were hiding in the village or nearby air raid shelters were dragged out one after another. According to interviews carried out by the New York Times and published by them in 2000, multiple elderly people from an Okinawan village confessed that after the United States had won the Battle of Okinawa, 3 armed Marines kept coming to the village every week to force the villagers to gather all the local women, who were then carried off into the hills and raped. The article goes deeper into the matter and claims that the village's tale, true or not, is part of a dark, long-kept secret, the unraveling of which refocused attention on what historians say is one of the most widely ignored crimes of the war, the widespread rape of Okinawan women by American servicemen. Although Japanese reports of rape were largely ignored at the time, academic estimates have been that as many as 10,000 Okinawan women may have been raped. It has been claimed that the rape was so prevalent that most Okinawans over age 65 around the year 2000 either knew or had heard of a woman who was raped in the aftermath of the war. Professor of East Asian Studies and expert on Okinawa, Steve Rabson, said, I have read many accounts of such rapes in Okinawan newspapers and books, but few people know about them or are willing to talk about them. He notes that plenty of old local books, diaries, articles and other documents refer to rapes by American soldiers of various races and backgrounds. An explanation given for why the U.S. military has no record of any rapes is that few Okinawan women reported abuse, mostly out of fear and embarrassment. According to an Okinawan police spokesman, victimized women feel too ashamed to make it public. Those who did report them are believed by historians to have been ignored by the U.S. military. Police. Many people wondered why it never came to light after the inevitable American-Japanese babies the many women must have given birth to. In interviews, Historians in Okinawan elders said that some of those Okinawan women who were raped and did not commit suicide did give birth to biracial children, but that many of them were immediately killed or left behind out of shame, disgust or fearful trauma. More often, however, rape victims underwent crude abortions with the help of village midwives. A large-scale effort to determine the possible extent of these crimes has never been conducted. Over 5 decades after the war had ended, in the late 1990s, the women who were believed to have been raped still overwhelmingly refused to give public statements, instead speaking through relatives and a number of historians and scholars. There is substantial evidence that the U.S. had at least some knowledge of what was going on. Samuel Saxton, a retired captain, explained that the American veterans and witnesses may have intentionally kept the rape a secret, largely out of shame. It would be unfair for the public to get the impression that we were all a bunch of rapists after we worked so hard to serve our country. Military officials formally denied the mass rapes, and all surviving related veterans refused the New York Times request for an interview. Masai Ishihara, a sociology professor, supports this. There is a lot of historical amnesia out there. Many people don't want to acknowledge what really happened, author George Pfeiffer noted in his book Tenno-san, The Battle of Okinawa and the Atomic Bomb, that by 1946 there had been fewer than 10 reported cases of rape in Okinawa. He explained it was partly because of shame and disgrace, partly because Americans were victors and occupiers. In all there were probably thousands of incidents, but the victims' silence kept rape another dirty secret of the campaign. Some other authors have noted that Japanese civilians were often surprised at the comparatively humane treatment they received from the American enemy, according to Islands of Discontent. Okinawan Responses to Japanese and American Power by Mark Selden. The Americans did not pursue a policy of torture, rape, and murder of civilians as Japanese military officials had warned. There were also 1,336 reported rapes during the first 10 days of the occupation of Kanagawa Prefecture after the Japanese surrender. European theater. The Kanikati Massacre involved the killing of Italian civilians by Lieutenant Colonel George Herbert McCaffrey. A confidential inquiry was made, but McCaffrey was never charged with an offense relating to the massacre. He died in 1954. This fact remained virtually unknown in the U.S. until 2005, when Joseph S. Salemi of New York University, whose father witnessed it, reported it. In the Biscayne Massacre, which consisted of 2 instances of mass murder, U.S. troops of the 45th Infantry Division killed roughly 75 prisoners of war, most of whom were Italian, according to an article in Der Spiegel by Klaus Wegerefer. Many personal memoirs of Allied soldiers have been willfully ignored by historians until now because they were at odds with the greatest generation mythology surrounding World War II. However, this has recently started to change, with books such as The Day of Battle by Rick Atkinson, where he describes Allied war crimes in Italy, and D-Day, The Battle for Normandy, by Anthony Beaver. Beaver's latest work is currently discussed by scholars, and should some of them be proven right, it suggests that Allied war crimes in Normandy were much more extensive than was previously realized. Historian Peter Lieb has found that many U.S. and Canadian units were ordered not to take enemy prisoners during the D-Day landings in Normandy. If this view is correct, it may explain the fate of 64 German prisoners who did not make it to the POW collecting point on Omaha Beach on the day of landings. Near the French village of Ordouville-la-Hubert, 30 German Wehrmacht prisoners were massacred by U.S. paratroopers. In the aftermath of the 1944 Malmedy Massacre, in which 80 American POWs were murdered by their German captors, a written order from headquarters of the 328th U.S. Army Infantry Regiment, dated 21 December 1944, stated, "No SS troops or paratroopers will be taken prisoner, but rather they will be shot on sight." Major General Raymond Hoft gave instructions to his troops not to take prisoners when they crossed the Rhine in 1945. After the war, when he reflected on the war crimes he authorized, he admitted, "If the Germans had won, I would have been on trial at Nuremberg instead of them." Stephen Ambrose related, "I've interviewed well over 1,000 combat veterans. Only one of them said he shot a prisoner. Perhaps as many as 1/3 of the veterans, however, related incidents in which they saw other GIs shooting unarmed German prisoners who had their hands up." Operation Teardrop involved 8 surviving captured crewmen from the sunken German submarine U-546 being tortured by U.S. military personnel. Historian Philip K. Lundeberg has written that the beating and torture of U-546's survivors was a singular atrocity motivated by the interrogators' need to quickly get information on what the U.S. believed were potential missile attacks on the continental U.S. by German submarines. The Dachau Massacre involved the killing of German prisoners of war and surrendering SS soldiers at the Dachau concentration camp. Among the American World War II veterans who did admit to having committed war crimes was former mafia hitman Frank Sheeran. In interviews with his biographer Charles Brandt, Sheeran recalled his war service with the Thunderbird Division as the time when he first developed a callousness to the taking of human life. By his own admission, Sheeran participated in numerous massacres and summary executions of German POWs, acts which violated the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 and the 1929 Geneva Convention on POWs. In his interviews with Brandt, Sheeran divided such massacres into 4 different categories. 1. Revenge killings in the heat of battle. Sheeran told Brandt that, when a German soldier had just killed his close friends and then tried to surrender, he would often send him to hell. 2. He described often witnessing similar behavior by fellow GIs. 2. Orders from unit commanders during a mission. When describing his first murder for organized crime, Sheeran recalled, "It was just like when an officer would tell you to take a couple of German prisoners back behind the line and for you to hurry back. You did what you had to do." 3. The Dachau Massacre and other reprisal killings of concentration camp guards and trustee inmates. 4. Calculated attempts to dehumanize and degrade German POWs. While Sheeran's unit was climbing the Harz Mountains, they came upon a Wehrmacht mule train carrying food and drink up the mountainside. The female cooks were first allowed to leave unmolested. Then Sheeran and his fellow GIs ate what we wanted and soiled the rest with our waste. Then the Wehrmacht mule drivers were given shovels in order to dig their own shallow graves. Sheeran later joked that they did so without complaint, likely hoping that he and his buddies would change their minds. But the mule drivers were shot and buried in the holes they had dug. Sheeran explained that by then, "I had no hesitation in doing what I had to do." Rape secret wartime files made public only in 2006 reveal that American GIs committed 400 sexual offenses in Europe, including 126 rapes in England, between 1942 and 1945. A study by Robert J. Lilly estimates that a total of 14,000 civilian women in England, France and Germany were raped by American GIs during World War II. It is estimated that there were around 3,500 rapes by American servicemen in France between June 1944 and the end of the war, and one historian has claimed that sexual violence against women in liberated France was common. Korean War. No-Gunri Massacre. The No-Gunri Massacre refers to an incident of mass killing of undetermined numbers of South Korean refugees conducted by U.S. soldiers of the 7th Cavalry Regiment between the 26th of July and the 29th of July 1950 at a railroad bridge near the village of Nogunri, 100 miles southeast of Seoul. In 2005, the South Korean government certified the names of 163 dead or missing and 55 wounded. It said many other victims' names were not reported. Over the years, survivors' estimates of the dead have ranged from 300 to 500. This episode early in the Korean War gained widespread attention when the Associated Press published a series of articles in 1999 that subsequently won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. Vietnam War. The Vietnam War Crimes Working Group files is a collection of documents compiled by Pentagon investigators in the early 1970s, confirming that atrocities by U.S. forces during the Vietnam War were more extensive than had been officially acknowledged. The documents are housed by the United States National Archives and Records Administration, and detail 320 alleged incidents that were substantiated by United States Army investigators. My Lai Massacre. The My Lai Massacre was the mass murder of 347 to 504 unarmed citizens in South Vietnam, almost entirely civilians, most of them women and children, conducted by U.S. soldiers from the Company C of the 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, 11th Brigade of the 23rd Infantry Division, on the 16th of March 1968. Some of the victims were raped, beaten, tortured, or maimed, and some of the bodies were found mutilated. The massacre took place in the hamlets of My Lai and My Khe of Sun Mai village during the Vietnam War. Of the 26 U.S. soldiers initially charged with criminal offenses or war crimes for actions at My Lai, only William Calley was convicted. Initially sentenced to life in prison, Calley had his sentence reduced to 10 years, then was released after only 3.5 years under house arrest. The incident prompted widespread outrage around the world, and reduced U.S. domestic support for the Vietnam War. 3 American servicemen, who made an effort to halt the massacre and protect the wounded, were sharply criticized by U.S. congressmen, and received hate mail, death threats, and mutilated animals on their doorsteps. 30 years after the event, their efforts were honored.